And welcome back. So for this second lecture, before we begin, I want you to take a moment to review what we've gone over in the past week. We've been working with this definition of race. On the one hand, there's the surface manifestation of how race comes to name the way that we classify bodies based on their visual appearance. And we've been paying attention to the material dimension of how the way that we categorize these bodies come to relate to who has privilege and who is increasingly exposed to premature death. If you've been paying attention to what's been happening in the news this past month, you very much know that race is not just about these categories, but very much about these material effects, and the way that it comes to mark the difference between who gets to live and who dies, who gets to be free and who gets imprisoned. So, before continuing, I want you to take a moment and think about the 4 scholarly articles for the week, and the way that they use this definition of race. So for example, we'd be thinking about Lisa Nakamura's article and how it's very much about this surface manifestation and the sort of assumptions that we make when we walk into situations where we try to understand race. She talks about the website All Look Same, which is very much about scrambling the certainty with which we come to categorize different bodies. And as we think about these material effects, we can range all the way over to Professor Ontiveros' article about how broadcast journalism's representation of the Chicano civil rights movement very much related to these questions of who was worth listening to versus who wasn't. Or as he argues on page 919, he gives examples of the way that racism determines, for example, who's allowed to live versus who's allowed to die, who's allowed to choose what life they want and who's forced to live it, who gets to choose where to live versus who is placed somewhere. These are all very much issues of agency when it comes to race and racism. Next, be sure that you can chart the 4 different scholarly articles using Wen and Tu's approach to popular culture. So to further expand on this chart, we can break down the articles on a one-to-one basis, but keep in mind that each scholarly reading can and should be understood in terms of these dynamics of popular culture. So beginning with this corner, we can think about pleasure and emotion in terms of Tasha Oren's article on representations of Asian American anger, right? That's very much about emotions, both in terms of representation, but also production in terms of what the artist wanted to communicate, and audience in terms of how it's received. If we think about aesthetics, we can immediately focus on Lisa Nakamura's article and the way that how her analysis of the All Look Same website complicates the sorts of conventions that we come to associate with the different meanings of race. In terms of politics, we can focus on Costanza Chalk's article and how she understands the relationship between social movements for social justice and commercial social media sites, right? Understanding the different relationships of power there. And finally, in terms of economics, we can focus on Professor Ontiveros' article and think about the way that broadcast journalism was constructed for particular audiences, and the way that broadcast journalism plays along certain conventions that are very much about legitimizing television and broadcast journalism as the mode of communication. The way that very much these stories are crafted as newsworthy based on their sellability and their sensationalism. You'll also notice that talking about economics is very much talking about the political economy from the last lecture. It's not just about the money at one's disposal, but the way that that money relates to one's power over the creation of meaning. Thirdly, be able to think about the 4 different scholarly articles in terms of the 3 processes named in Habel, Payan, and Romero's introduction: representation, production, and audience. Of course, representation is easy for us because it's understanding the text that's in front of us. But also, be sure to be able to think about how each different scholarly article talks about issues of production. Who's producing it? For what reason? Who profits? And also think about these issues of audience. Who is meant to consume this product? What meanings are they making out of it? In what ways does this popular cultural text relate to issues of everyday life? You'll notice that these issues become really important in talking about, for example, Lisa Nakamura's article and how her analysis of the representation on the website, when you take a step back from it and think about it as being a cultural text created by people, designated for a particular audience. How these issues of production and audience really challenges any sort of assumptions we could be making in terms of what the website's doing. And finally, be thinking about the way that each scholarly article talks about the relationship between Asian Americans and Latinas and Latinos in terms of hegemony. You'll notice that in the spread of articles that Christina and I have chosen for each week, we're talking about different aspects of this diagram of hegemony. Of course, in talking about race and popular culture, particularly as we're thinking about mass culture, we're very much talking about ideology. We're focusing on racial ideologies that have become naturalized, and the way that those racial ideologies then come to justify particular forms of racism. But Christina and I have also included articles that focus on Asian Americans, Latinas and Latinos, and agency, right? Agency as the ability to make choices. So you'll notice that at least one article each week focuses on what it means to exist amongst these racial ideologies of hegemony. But you'll also notice that at least one article each week focuses on issues of counter-hegemonic resistance, particularly as they're embodied by continued community activism. So be thinking about our scholarly articles each week in terms of these approaches to popular culture, the way that they relate to hegemony, and the way that they come to define and redefine race. So, as we continue on with this lecture, again, we have 3 key terms and 2 large connections to be made. The key terms are subjectivity, subjectlessness, and whiteness. So the first 2 terms, subjectivity and subjectlessness, are very much about issues of representation. Not just cultural representation, but also political representation. What does it mean to exist in these bodies? So here we'll be focusing on the connections between Tasha Oren's article and Lisa Nakamura's article. As we think about these first terms, you'll be thinking about the diagram of hegemony. You'll be thinking about this diagram of intersectionality. Here's us being shaped by culture and the social structure. Here's us being shaped by these intersecting dynamics of identity and difference. So, as we talk about subjectivity, we're very much focusing on this us that exists within these cultural systems and these social structures. We can define subjectivity as the state of possessing a sense of self that is shaped by power relations. As you can tell, to talk about subjectivity is, on the one hand, very philosophical, but on the other hand, very much about what it means to exist in our social reality. Subjectivity focuses on who we are, but how who we are is constantly shaped by these larger dynamics of power in terms of the cultural systems and in terms of the social structures that come to bear on our everyday life. So that's why it's very useful to think about subjectivity in relation to intersectionality. Because who we are is constantly being impacted upon by these dynamics of identity and difference as they cut across these cultural systems and these social structures. So subjectivity, as you see in Lisa Nakamura's article, is talked about in relation to subjectlessness. Subjectlessness can be defined as a critical approach that interrogates the power relations that shape subjectivity. So, going back to the diagram of intersectionality, subjectivity focuses on the us as it's constantly shaped by these other fields of power. Subjectlessness thinks beyond this us and focuses on these cultural systems and these social structures, right? Presuming beforehand that there is no single us, but there are traceable patterns that can be found as we think about these larger dynamics. And of course, as Nakamura argues, it's important to think about subjectivity and subjectlessness together. So as we think about subjectivity and subjectlessness, we arrive at our fourth and final key point. issues of perspective. And so here we can put Lisa Nakamura's article in relation to Randy Ontiveros' article. Both articles very much focus on, to borrow from Abel Payan and Romero, issues of production as well as issues of audience, besides just representation. These articles ask very important questions about who is the audience. Ontiveros' analysis of broadcast journalism focuses on this idea of a mainstream audience and catering to a mainstream audience. He also focuses on how the people doing most of the speaking and doing the production are representing the Chicano civil rights movement from the outside. And even when members of the Chicano civil rights movement were being interviewed, he analyzes how it wasn't actually necessarily about sharing their perspective, but instead taking an outsider's viewpoint on it, however judgmental that may be. Nakamura also asks similar questions about perspective, looking at the All Look Same website. For example, in talking about the actual website, she focuses on how it really highlights particular assumptions being made by Asian Americans within the Asian American community, right? So she's thinking about a community audience. However, in looking at the way that the website's creator, for example, refuses progressive Asian American politics, we can understand how this is also another issue of perspective. The idea of bringing a community perspective to the mainstream, that's not happening. This is why it's important to think about concepts such as bridging text, or to think about concepts such as the newsnet, because each of these asks complicated questions about who is speaking to whom for what purpose. Just because there may be an Asian American body or a Latina body on screen doesn't necessarily mean that the community is being represented, and that's why it's important to think about popular culture from these multiple different angles. So as we think about perspective, we're also forced to think about whiteness, particularly in terms of mass culture. We can define whiteness as the naturalization of racial privilege to the point at which it becomes unremarkable. We can see this very clearly in Professor Ontiveros' article, when he talks about the different news conventions that were being used to cater to this mainstream audience. This mainstream audience obviously is not participating in the Chicano civil rights movement. And in fact, as we even think about the idea of the mainstream, think about other examples where people talk about race and racism in popular culture. There's always this looming question about not seeming too political or not trying to offend anyone or step on anyone's toes. These are all ways of talking about whiteness without ever naming it. This idea that there is this somehow universal person to which we all must be speaking to if we're talking about the mainstream. We're talking about how privilege has become so naturalized that it comes to be completely unremarkable, and in fact becomes an expectation that we would cater to it. So, along with whiteness, we can also think along the different axes of identity and difference, and think about how each of these different categories has a privilege category that is so full of privilege that it's become completely naturalized, right? We can think about it in gender in terms of masculinity, for example. So, you have 6 key terms as well as 4 key connections that we started to make across the articles. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to your case studies.